welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I'm your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin. This is episode 37 of World War Now, and let me tell you, we have a extremely packed show for you this week. As usual, right as we wrapped recording for the last episode, Lukashenko comes out and starts making crazy statements that totally change the game, change everybody's perspective on the operational and a broader situation on the ground and what the objectives are. We, of course, have a lot of stuff to talk about in Africa, stuff going on in Israel, France, updates on Strelkov, China, and the US's conflict heating up. And then they come out with UFO stuff as well to boot. So we have a big show. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad, and yes, absolutely. Like, there's things going on all around the world, and of course, half the African continent, of course, arrives in Russia in order for to participate in probably the greatest diplomatical feat we've seen involving the African countries in recent times, right? Since at least 2019, since the beginning of COVID. So, there's a lot to discuss here, and even updates regarding the church, of course, are absolutely tremendous. I'd say, especially based on this, the beginning of the SMO. A lot of things have changed, but definitely. And I guess to start, there's a lot to talk about in regards to President Lukashenko and Putin basically putting on what I think could not be understated, the biggest political show in like a good way, displaying their power and displaying their confidence to the public since the beginning of the year. So we are about halfway through, or more than halfway through 2023 at this point, and we have seen Putin and Lukashenko interact with not just the public and not just the Orthodox public of Russia, but just openly walking amongst the people, walking along St. Petersburg, visiting the Holy Valam Island monastery in Russia's north, which essentially is by many considered to be the Mount Athos of Russia, and was established around the same time, around 150 years after Mount Athos. So very much these good vibes essentially from at the beginning of the week, which we simply just missed out when we did our prior recording.
Yeah, with all the Lukashenko, Putin stuff, we're going to talk about all of that. And there's, of course, Prigozhin stuff to talk about. We may have to, and I believe we may have to readjust our winners and losers predictions, not because we were wrong, but because I think we were almost too correct in a certain level. And I think before we get into that, I think we'll talk about what Lukashenko said. And just, I mean, in like two different kind of meetings they had, at one point he comes in and he's talking about how Putin, these Wagner guys are begging to go on an expedition into Poland. And he then, in that context, brings up Poland supposedly threatening Galicia, which, again, if you remember correctly, Putin said Galicia should have never even been taken by the Russian Empire. Yet here we have Lukashenko saying that Russia and Belarus would go into Ukraine to protect Western Ukrainian territory from Polish aggression, and that I guess Wagner would help with that. And then to top all that off, at one point he shows a map to Putin, which he says, this map is where the offensive is prepared, and it's just a map of Poland. So I have a few ideas, of course, but I'm interested in where this new kind of saber rattling with Poland is going to go. Last episode, of course, we mentioned the insane levels of military spending that Poland is undertaking and the bellicose rhetoric they're engaging with on their border, of course, with the full support of the United States. But, Lukashenko, again, up until now, he's sure they still are the one supporting party on the Russian side of the war due to their, I believe, allowance of certain missile systems to be placed on their border, especially at the beginning of the special military operation. But even recently, Lukashenko said that we will never do anything preemptively. We will only attack if the borders of Belarus itself are attacked. However, with the escalation of Poland's rhetoric, with some of Ukraine's rhetoric about Belarus, the Union State has been invoked, which is a whole other kind of entity with which technically Lukashenko is the head. That is this, this pre-Union organization that fully integrates the Belarusian economy and in some ways even defense structure with Russia. It's kind of a interesting thing they have going on despite not being united legally, but yeah, it seems that the Belarusian, Polish, Ukrainian border, and even like the Lithuanian border and the corridor to Kaliningrad, that is very much in the spotlight right now.
That's right. Yeah, the system that Belarus and Russia essentially are building upon, it was established by the Soviet Union essentially, and since the 1990s, especially when Russia went into its weakened state under the Yeltsin and Chubais government, and economically, of course, it went downhill. Its influence over international relations and foreign policy greatly decreased. So the idea of an allied Union state with Belarus, of course, fell. Even though it was still there, the foundations were there, and the legislation, constitutionally speaking, it could still be called upon. It just wasn't it just wasn't on anybody's radar for a very, very long time. But of course, Kazakhstan was the previous nation alongside Ukraine to pull out of the Union State sort of post-Soviet agreement which existed. So, we'll probably bring that up in future episodes when Kazakhstan becomes more of a big deal, because that country still very much has an undetermined political compass. But Belarus definitely, it looks like President Lukashenko has set his eyes upon and a firm alliance with Russia, especially I think given the protests of 2019 and his rhetoric towards Poland. And notice Poland is an important country for Belarus. It's not just the neighbor which needs to be intimidated, and statements need to be made about. No, Belarus is the country which houses Lukashenko's primary political opponent, the lady that of course claims to be the president elect of Belarus. She was essentially kicked out of Belarus in 20. I mean, even before 2019, she's the wife of a prominent liberal Belarusian politician who's right now in Belarusian prison. And so the liberal opposition to Belarus is frankly stationed in Poland right next door, and they're essentially just waiting for something to happen to Lukashenko in order to come in and seize power. So any sort of rhetorical statements against Poland, we have to keep in mind Lukashenko is looking out for himself, as he should, because those liberals, they're essentially a Zelensky type of government which will come into Belarus and essentially transform it into what we see Ukraine as today, a completely degenerate sort of society. They'll bring in, of course, so-called free election. They'll bring in gay marriage, the alphabet community's favorite themes, and it will be transformed and essentially made quite different, and this cultural separation from Russia will be, of course, increased. Speaking of gaps in cultural separation, the what should be noted is Wagner's potential here. But Lukashenko mentions that Wagner could enter into Western Ukraine in order to to take over and protect it against Polish invasion, which again, it's a little bit different to what we saw from the potential military analysts on Twitter and other websites earlier. Even Jackson Hinkle, of course, mentioning on YouTube that Wagner's secret plan was to attack north through Gostomel and enter into Kiev again, right? A quick drive. But it looks like Wagner potentially might be even looking at securing the connection between something like Kaliningrad and Belarus, which the connection there is a 65-kilometer strait called the Suwalki Gap, which goes between Belarus to Kaliningrad, that one sort of the old Königsberg city of Prussia, which Russia now controls since World War II. And the only way this territory can be connected through Russia would be through Belarus and this international corridor going through Poland and Lithuania, two NATO countries. Now, granted, it's only 65 kilometers, which could be could be driven through in about half an hour, 30 minutes time, but we've seen Wagner, of course, drive their vehicles at pretty high speeds. So in order to secure that connection, I think Wagner could be used to a high capacity if we're speaking about actual serious palpable effects. Because again, could Wagner enter into Poland and capture some of the key military bases close to the Polish-Belarusian border? Absolutely. But where would they go from there? How would Article 5 of NATO activate? It's simply a little bit unknown at this point. Whereas could Wagner operate with complete discretion in Western Ukraine if things escalate? Absolutely. So we could almost see like a pincer maneuver here, Conrad, because in the south we see Odessa being bombarded and perhaps something being staged in the future, as we discussed with Transnistria and the grain deal being seized. And from the north, of course, there's now this Belarusian Wagner pressure. So in fact, I do think it's not just bland rhetoric that we see from Lukashenko and Putin, of course, joking around in front of the mic, mentioning, and Putin last 2 weeks ago bringing up the history of Poland and bringing up Stalin and all these historical references, which we had no idea what that was a reference to. And then Lukashenko arrives and gives us the full-on take, which it was even more extreme than what Putin was talking about a fortnight ago. And it all kind of makes sense now. Poland is very much on the radar for Russia. They are aware of what Poland is doing with their military, and they do want to, I suppose, intimidate them to some extent.
Many people have said this, that the Polish U.S. Embassy in Poland is kind of becoming like, I believe it was the U.S. Embassy in Honduras was the base of operations for all of the U.S. intelligence black operations that destabilized regimes they found unfriendly throughout Latin America. And in many ways, I think Russia's aware that a lot of, in general, their problems and the problems with foreign aid and intelligence and with sabotage is coming directly out of the American embassy in Warsaw. So they're very much aware of all of that. They're obviously very aware of the Baltic countries as well. And you mentioned the Odessa bombardment and everything, and of course we can, again, at this point, it's hopeful. We're hopeful that that is indicative of Russia hoping to push through Nikolaev and Odessa and eventually actually take those territories. And that brings us to the idea that we've heard talk of a possible extra 500,000 men mobilized in Russia, possibly to also resume operations in Kharkov and other parts of northern eastern Ukraine. So that's obviously on everybody's radar as well. And the Ukrainians are like, they've gone like full balls to the wall. I mean, people have said this a lot, but this really seems like it might be their last full mobilization that they can even do. They're on their like 12th mobilization or whatever. And as this begins to fail, I think again we mentioned Strelkov's arrest and his detention until September 18th. I think that's an interesting time window to keep looking at because that may be when we see big movement.
I mean, there's so many mixed takes, I guess, being given not just by ourselves, but and other analysts, but also by even the presidents themselves. You know, Lukashenko did mention a peace deal a month ago, like openly said that Russia and Ukraine needed to seek a peace deal sometime in autumn before winter of 2023, and and now he comes out and mentions Poland. And honestly, I think it needs to be stated that what Lukashenko and Putin spoke about openly into the mic without their ties on was probably not what they discussed behind closed doors. And behind closed doors, they most likely discussed Prigozhin a lot closer, keep in mind. They probably discussed the presence of Wagner, what the actual plans are. Is Lukashenko planning to house Wagner long term, or is he planning to give them back to Russia? And of course, Putin probably doesn't want them after the humiliating events that occurred on the 24th of June, 2023. I think Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin are still pretty much upset at Prigozhin that he pulled off this huge PR stunt, which I guess we could talk about exactly how that to change the perception of who the winners were based on this recent African summit. We could see a lot of Prigozhin in St. Petersburg, and he seems to have emerged on top. But nevertheless, Lukashenko, I think. We'll see what the future of Wagner will be, I guess, foothold this year, or maybe even in the next few months. Will Wagner be completely dispersed into Africa, or will they actually be stationed, a portion of them be stationed in Belarus long term? Because remember, Lukashenko's attitude towards Wagner was very, very openly negative in 2019 and 2020, when in the middle of COVID in July 2020, Lukashenko arrested 33 Wagner soldiers who were on transit through Belarus. So they were simply arrested by Belarusian intelligence and held, detained for several days at least. So, and of course, there is that fear that early Wagner was very much associated perhaps with political assassinations, very covert, you can say like MI6 almost type actions around the world. So there is that fear that, well, having Wagner in your country is a potential liability. And Lukashenko is a very, very smart politician. He's been around for 30 years, even longer than Putin has. So he very much knows how to keep power. And Wagner is a wild card. Does Lukashenko want this wild card long term on his territory, on his land? And Prigozhin is a jester. He's like the Joker from Batman. You cannot predict what this top J, this top P, I guess, whatever you want to call him, will do. He's lied to Putin, he's lied to us through his Telegram posts, he's lied to multiple people, and he's always made it up. And in fact, you can always almost say we forgive him for that because it's just part of his image. Like, he is this snake, he is the snake that deceived Adam and Eve, and it's just very bizarre. And I mean, what can we expect from this like Jewish Vin Diesel when he drives his tanks at Moscow in this Fast and Furious type scene almost a month ago? Like, completely unpredictable character. And yeah, there's more than meets the eye. I think Lukashenko probably discussed Prigozhin very heavily with Putin at this meeting behind closed doors. But again, for the public image, it was mostly a big meme about how Poland may potentially invade Western Ukraine. I think that's more to do with the military side of things, even less to do with Putin and Lukashenko, more to do with Gerasimov, Shoigu. It's a military, the Minister of Defense of Belarus, for example. It's more for them to actually calculate and to war game rather even than for Putin and Lukashenko to discuss. But I think politically speaking, this meeting was great. Perhaps we can discuss even the religious side of things, because religiously speaking, the image, the public relations, you can call it a PR stunt, but I think it was a genuine expression of Orthodox solidarity between the Belarusian people and the Russians, in the personified and individualized by their presidents, visiting Valam, visiting the Kronstadt Naval Cathedral in St. Petersburg, these big shows of solidarity. I mean, it's very different to what we saw after the Prigozhin coup, when Putin visited Dagestan and said like the Quran was sacred for all peoples. Of course, a sacrilegious statement, and Putin made a huge mistake, but and eventually a huge earthquake hit Dagestan, literally days later, which of course was a sign of God that you shouldn't be making these really mistaken sacrilegious blasphemous statements, especially if you're a head of state, because God is watching. He has granted you power. President Putin, President Lukashenko, you guys need to watch your, I guess, watch your actions and words, especially to a larger audience. A lot of people are influenced by your actions. And so these two presidents visiting these holy sites and even going out to the public, I'm sure you've seen the clips, Conrad, where they go outside of the Naval Cathedral after the liturgy, they kiss all the icons, and then they start hugging people. There's women bringing their kids to them. They're taking photos, selfies, and one of the women says, "Well, what about the quarantine?" Right? Because everyone had to essentially solidify this quarantine around Putin before meeting him prior to, I mean, since the beginning of COVID, even journalists needed to enter into a 1 week quarantine, I believe it was minimum, before even receiving an interview with Putin or getting to see him in person. So they had a very tight schedule, no diseases getting to the president. His safety was paramount. And at this point, Putin just says openly, just says, "Oh, don't worry about the quarantine. The people are more important." As the local, the archpriest from the cathedral standing right next to him. It's just a very strong image, very anti-Covidian, you could say. And I think we're very glad that entire era is over.
Yeah, I think he should probably just nix that whole policy in general. I mean, I understand it can be kind of used as a flex on people and a way to, he's a bit of a, if anyone's in danger, I guess he would be, but it's, come on, man. I think the meme virus is over. But that being said, I mean, you talk about Prigozhin and the results of Wagner in Belarus and everything. And look, Prigozhin, he's just flying back to St. Petersburg whenever he wants. I mean, he's been pictured with representatives from the Central African Republic, which we know Wagner is, deeply embedded with the current government there. And that leads us right into kind of our other main thing we need to talk about, which is the coup in Niger. And at this point, Russia and its proxies have basically, taken over all of the Sahel region, from Sudan all the way over to Mali, Burkina Faso, now Niger. Central African Republic had already happened, of course, with now the only country remaining in that region under French somewhat influence is Chad, and we already know that Wagner is making inroads there. So I know, I mean, Niger, Chad, I mean, I don't think I need to make any of these jokes on the show for the people. People in the comments can do that for themselves. But I think France's number one source of uranium has fallen, their government has fallen. That comes after, of course, Burkina Faso. And more and more likely, Mali, of course, already one of the biggest countries that the French influenced government fell and pro-Russian forces took over. And now once Chad, you need to realize that once Chad goes, then that's basically a clean sweep for Russia and its Wagner kind of wing of its pseudo-military overseas, having completely wiped out French influence in this region. And this, of course, comes as this huge African summit is being held in Russia, where Putin's forgiving billions of dollars of debt, pledging free grain to countries like Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, Eritrea, these countries that are allied with Russia. He's meeting with the heads of Ethiopia. He's even, I think, mediating some conflicts that are going on in Africa. Like I said, there are ongoing conflicts between Eritrea, Ethiopia, and this coup in Niger, again, these coups in these countries kind of all go down the same way, in the sense that some force that has weapons, whether it's like the president's guard or an aspect of the military or some police force, ends up, detaining the president or detaining somebody. And then everyone waits for an announcement on the TV. And so much buzz was going on before the TV announcement, and all the French outlets were desperately saying that no, President Bazoum is still in power. All of this is fine. There's no coup. The military is on the side of the president. The protesters in the street are anti-push, anti-coup. And next thing you know, we're seeing protesters in the streets all waving Russian flags, climbing on top of the sites in the center of these cities in Niger. And of course, the TV announcement comes on, and it's military forces announcing that the president has been arrested. Prigozhin congratulates Niger on its successful coup. And basically even France, despite denouncing the government and saying they still recognize the old president, they've written out any kind of intervention. All they're going to do is sanctions. So once again, total Wagner victory. It seems that they're going to get the clean sweep. We're going to just keep watching Chad, of course. But I mean, this is World War now. This is, what we're talking about. I think we can safely say that between Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, the Caucasus region, Turkey and Syria as well, and now, of course, the Sahel region of Africa, you can even kind of tie in Ethiopia and a lot of the Horn of Africa into this as well. I mean, it's fully into World War III. I mean, this is multiple fronts, proxies, everyone. You can line up every group in these conflicts with kind of a side in some capacity. in the current ongoing conflict in Ukraine. So I think we can safely say that it's real.
Yeah, and I guess a big positive for Russia, at least in terms of foreign policy, whether it's a positive for the African countries or for the West, is still to be determined. Definitely not for the West, because Wagner Group has come up as this essentially authoritarian boogeyman for Western countries, almost on their perspective, an almost Al Qaeda like organization that causes so much distress to their influence and essentially their position in African countries. Like we brought up, remember, with Jim Jatras a few weeks ago, actually, the potential of, and then this is a real fear that Western countries have of Wagner actually becoming involved similar in a similar capacity to Ukraine, where Wagner sends in operatives. They're African actually operatives, because they have actually trained African militiamen and mercenaries and sending them into Western Europe in order to cause disruption. I keep seeing this story actually come up, and now we're seeing Niger, of course, fall to a coup, and it's still kind of unclear exactly. And Niger, mind you, is it's a French-speaking country. Besides all the various African dialects, their primary language is simply Arabic and French. So we can see a complete full picture here. France at the moment is still burning up in riots. They are calming down to some extent, but there is that fear of, well, these African Middle Eastern immigrants, where are they coming from? And they're coming from Niger, Nigeria, Morocco, Algeria, the Northern African continent, essentially. And France has this internal problem now. The as you can see from the West, disruption in this particular sub-Saharan region, especially in the French-speaking countries, is already a huge blow to French capacity to hold everything under control, which Macron was doing quite well. I mean, since I would say even the previous French president, since the bombing of Libya, it's been fairly stable. The stability was quite strongly in France's favor. And if you recall, just a few months ago, we spoke about the coup in Sudan, and that not the coup, but there was a potential coup with the militia fighting against I guess the primary PMC slash militia type organization, similar to Wagner, was, I guess, set up against the national military of the country in Sudan. And that war and that civil conflict is still ongoing. It's not as hot as what we see in Ukraine, but people are still dying on the ground, so there's still calamity. The country is still really unstable. No international investors are putting money into Sudan. It's simply too unsafe. So the main downside, I think, for local businesses, the local economy, I would say, in terms of these coups and militias and uprisings, is politically speaking, yes, they do achieve certain goals which perhaps they couldn't have achieved based on these electronic and paper-based fake elections. But in terms of if they want to obtain international financial support and even investments from countries like China, China will be a bit less hesitant, to throw in investments into countries where there are literal military coups going on. So there is that gamble. It's like, well, if you're going to have a military coup, you have to do it very swiftly. The power needs to be taken over quickly. And of course, the West, notice how the democratically elected president of Niger instantly, of course, cried out to Western powers to save me, save me. And all these crowds come up in the streets, these pro-democratic liberal crowds who are pro-LGBT, and they want Niger to be a modern country. And where were these people last year or even during COVID or years ago, right? We didn't see this movement. It's almost like terrorist cells within the nation itself. We keep mentioning the fifth column, but almost every country has its own CIA setup of a fifth column. Whenever there's unrest or something anti-democratic occurs, these cells could be activated and used against the powers that are positioned against the New World Order, the EU, the US, etc. We saw this in Ukraine, we saw this in Belarus, and of course in African countries as well. And frankly, I mean, Prigozhin's comments, what can be said about that? It's a dark comedy, considering everybody was stating that he was almost about to procure a coup in Moscow and to take out Putin, take out Gerasimov and Shoigu, but that never took place. And so it's a little bit funny that, I mean, he understands the humor. This guy is literally the modern Joker, or at least the closest character we have to a Joker, and it's almost like a Batman villain. So some of his jokes are somewhat amusing. I think it's important to keep an eye out exactly on Wagner's presence in Niger, which today has been somewhat minimal. But again, if if Niger elects a new government which is more pro-Russian, perhaps they'll have a Wagner bodyguard, which is similar to the Central African Republic. I mean, we do need to keep that in mind. These are really high on the potential list, and of course, we know that Wagner will not be bought off by American organizations, by liberal NGOs and other things. So there is some stability in that for the African nations.
Prigozhin, he's, I guess, just not facing any consequences for the attempted coup and is just congratulating other countries on coups where he plays a hand. I mean, I think it's understood that the forces that took over from the former president, I believe they had some training from Wagner affiliates and whatnot. It may have been in some of the bordering countries as well. But in general, again, this is like Mali, all the Burkina Faso. I mean, the head of the junta in Burkina Faso that's pro-Russian is in Russia, making all these anti-French, anti-colonial statements, and Putin's, applauding them. Clearly, between this and all the Lukashenko stuff, he's very much kind of on the rhetorical offensive as of right now. I think he sees that maybe they're on their back. The U.S. is on its back foot a little bit, and things are only going to ramp up as the election kind of increases in the public consciousness and in everybody's mind. But that kind of brings us to the whole France thing. And again, France has lost so much influence in Africa. It comes right after the huge riots and everything. And the thing is that the fallout of that is still going on. What we've seen basically in the past few days is the police in France basically stage a successful coup against, the anti-police forces in the government and effectively secure total immunity, not like from the law, but they're kind of are held to a different standard of the law, basically. I mean, they have like all this functional protection. They have total anonymity whenever they're accused of any kind of misdeeds now. Supposedly like specialized magistrates and almost like particular police courts for police accused of wrongdoing or anything. So basically what happened was Darmanin, the interior minister of France, went at all these meetings with the heads of the police unions, the heads of these police departments, and he ended up making a statement, I think, with in frame the two most right-wing police force unions in France, and basically caved to all of their demands. So national rallies congratulating them. So as far as this, again, I'm not necessarily just cheering on a new police state coming in, but for better or for worse, the police institutions in France are more right-wing. So this is a institutional victory for, order and the right wing in France. We'll see how it's used against, maybe future more populist protests. But in general, Macron apparently, gave the whistle to totally cave to the police. So it shows that the police have very much been in power in France.
Yeah, I think I think a lot of the listeners also still have a really bad taste in their mouth from any mention of police being granted more power than they're actually due legislatively and through procedures and policies. I mean, considering what occurred during the last 3 years during the COVID tyranny. And so whether or not these French police officers will actually establish order and put the migrants to rest will be, kind of calm them down, essentially, will be the determining factor of whether or not they're a net positive for France, or if this is another Masonic way of actually controlling the situation from the top, essentially controlling the police chiefs, maybe giving it a more BLM-like appeal, which doesn't seem to be the case here. It's not like we won't see any police officers standing on their knees praying for, praying for peace. They'll be out there doing what they're being paid for, and it's protecting the citizens and essentially enforcing the law, which is kind of what I think France really needs right now in terms of stability. And speaking to a few people living in France right now, there is this air of unease, especially a lot of Orthodox communities in France, and even potentially the future heir to the. There's a lot of Romanovs and a lot of really high class Russian nobility living in France right now, and the news coming out of the Russian diaspora in France is pretty bad. I mean, they're not liking the protests. They're quite it's not even racism, but they are very wary of the Muslim population. And I think given the crackdowns in Moscow as well, they also may be inspired by what's happening in France. So that's kind of one of the net positives, right? Regardless of what occurs in France, is that Russia is copying this particular model of, okay, well, you see the police are cracking down in France on these protesters. That means we can do the same on the illegal Tajiks and Kyrgyzstanis, these illegal migrants living on the outskirts of Moscow in these crammed apartments and working for below minimum wage, essentially even worse conditions than some illegal Mexicans are working in the US. Really bad conditions, and of course high disparity in terms of illegal prostitution, drug trafficking. All these issues are associated with this, including. I mean, I'm not going to go into too deep into this particular subject, but because it has been ongoing, but the Russians have been cracking down on all these illegal immigrant dens, and most of them are Muslim, so there has been mosque raids, And the Muslims in Russia have responded with small, more or less localized riots with a maximum of 200 people per suburb, of course, rioting against the police. But again, it's nothing to the scale of what we see in France. And this ties into other big debates in Russia occurring right now. For example, the Minister of Health in Russia has proposed banning abortion clinics locally, private abortion clinics, which since about 10 years ago have stopped providing their abortion statistics to the Russian government. Well, they're not really, they just stopped, and so essentially we didn't have a clear picture of where abortion rates were going in Russia. Were they decreasing? Were they increasing? And recent outcry against this has, of course, improved. But one of the arguments, I guess, even against abortion or even pro-abortion, no, it's just a pro-abortion argument, which legitimately arises in Russia. I know it's horrible speaking that a lot of our listeners are Christian, and I myself am very pro-life. I've been to many pro-life protests in my time, and actively been pushing these sort of policies on the ground. But you have to consider the fact that in Russia, in particular, most of the rapes occur and most of the sexual assaults are done by these illegal migrants who are in majority men. For every 20 men arriving in Russia from Tajikistan, from Central Asia, from the Middle East, there is roughly one woman. Okay, so and of course these statistics are not released by the FSB, by the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Russia, which controls the police force. We don't get these FBI type statistics, and you have to consider that there is that consideration that all these migrants were let in, and of course the rates of sexual assault, the disparity between who exactly is causing the assaults is very evident, I think, to the local Moscow populace, especially of the large Russian cities, especially Moscow, St. Petersburg. It's very clear who's causing all the sexual assaults, if the we don't have to go into the abortion debate, but there is that consideration there. The Russian government, of course, attempts to ban abortion now, which they've kept legal for 30 years after the Yeltsin government took over, and of course 23 years of Vladimir Putin's United Russia government with Shoigu. And what we see today is they've also allowed all these illegal immigrants who are raping everybody on the outskirts. A lot of Russian women, of course, the rape rates are not as high as what we see in Western Europe, but still high to the point of people actually being concerned. And there is this consideration there that none of these policies, including the anti-abortion policy, are being done to benefit anybody. It's essentially just the considerable amount to get, of course, a net good for Russia. Russia needs to ban abortion finally after 30 odd years, even 100 years since the Bolshevik Revolution. But there is also the alongside abortion, illegal immigration needs to be controlled, and also these migrants need to be put to rest and not allowed to riot as they are in France, and also cause all these criminal disparities, I guess, shall we say, which are still occurring in Moscow. Huge concern, not just for myself, my relatives, for people. If you have loved ones living in Moscow, especially on the outskirts, it's a real fear, right? It's not just the clips we see on TikTok and Telegram and YouTube. These are real concerns for Muscovites and citizens of the Third Rome. So it's just the reality on the ground. It's not just France which is affected by these modern issues.
France, as the police thing goes on, I think it's interesting because it's almost indisputable that a right-wing government is going to come to power in France, most likely in the next presidential elections. I mean, the right-wing parties are now dominant in the parliament and everything, and with the police now empowered in many ways. Again, part of gaining power in these institutions is hard because maybe a right-wing party gets elected, but then the whole judiciary, all these institutions, the unions, everything are against them, so they can't really get anything done. But now the police, which again the main police unions are pretty right-wing, they have now gained this institutional level of power. So maybe if a right-wing government takes power in France, they'd be able to really cement themselves in power, as it were, and not just immediately get crushed due to international left-wing Zionist pressure. We'll see how all of that goes. But I mean, that kind of leads us into the whole Israel thing, which is undergoing its own, revolution, and from, their perceived, nationalist religious party, Likud is led by Benjamin Netanyahu, is trying to take a lot of power. They're basically trying to give the Knesset full authority over the Supreme Court, where, up until now, the Supreme Court was, the appointments are for life and they appoint their replacement and everything. But again, there's no constitution in Israel, and this is basically the sort of thing that if it goes through, Netanyahu will be able to. He'd been in power for so long, and it took this massive coalition of basically everybody uniting on people that disagreed on everything, uniting just to be against Netanyahu. That didn't last very long. He's back in power, and now he's basically trying to make sure that what happened that time is never going to be able to happen again. And again, I don't really have any problem with this method of politics from a right wing perspective, especially in Christian European countries. But you know, regardless who's in power in Israel, we know how they treat us, our Western countries, and how they influence our politics negatively. And specifically, Likud, the religious ultra Zionist party, their explicit goal is effectively to restore Greater Israel, rebuild the Third Temple, and seat their Moshiach Antichrist on the throne in Jerusalem. So insofar as I can maybe sympathize with people from a nationalist perspective in some capacity, I can't I can't just support that because it's the right wing equivalent going on in Israel. That's I don't think, and we'll, the whole Donald Trump question is raised. We'll see how much Trump remembers the fact that Netanyahu congratulated Biden very early when the election was stolen from him. I hope he doesn't just crawl back to Netanyahu. That'll really put to rest a few of the questions that people have if that does happen. But the protests are big. All the liberals, all the secular Jews in Israel are not happy. But as we know, the birth rates, within 50 years, the majority of Israel is going to be these Haredi, religious Orthodox Jews that are outbreeding the secular ones. And this is going to have a dramatic effect on the foreign policy in the region, considering that all the Muslim countries have really already turned against Israel in a major way. I think only Jordan is kind of still maintaining its status quo on that. And if they're going to go the full religious ultra-Zionist path, that's going to lead to some conflicts very, very fast.
Yeah, I think Israel is a very curious country because, for listeners who aren't aware, Israel is probably one of the more functional democracies in the Middle East. Actually has a more or less proper separation of powers between the parliament, the executive branch, which is the cabinet, the president of the prime minister of Israel, essentially, and the judiciary branch, which of course is the judicial branch of the Supreme Court and the High Court of Israel, of course, being kind of thrown into the debate at the moment. So, and the Knesset, which is their version of the parliament, and the Duma is very much divided. It doesn't have these two strong oppositionary parties similar to the United States. We have the Democrats and the Republicans, and it's even I guess it's even more separate, and it even has more variety than, say, even the Russian Duma. And obviously, unlike the Russian Duma, where United Russia controls definitely more than 2/3 of all the seats and has the ability to actually alter the constitution at will, the power of the Knesset, of course, is a lot more disparate and separated. Which Israel, you could say, is a functional democracy in the Middle East, and their population being so homogenous and, of course, united around this idea of national solidarity. Of course, population being below 10 million and also surrounded by enemies for decades has increased this, I guess, national. Even though notice Israel is the capital of the LGBTQ and the alphabet community, right, in the Middle East itself as well. So they have these strange, you could say, degenerate trends, which ultimately are bad for culture, but their birth rate is still quite high, which is impressive. It means that, and abortion is legal too. So all this means is that, essentially, the national idea of Israel, the culture built around, I guess, just the national solidarity, the belief in that Israel is something special, that it's worth living for, it's worth having children for, it's so powerful. It actually overrides degenerate cultural trends and even anti-state policies such as abortion. And it's kind of, in a way, an inspirational example. It does show that.
Well, it really just
Mhm.
well, it just secures the future for the ultra
Mhm.
religious Jews because all the secular Jews get all the abortions and do all the gay stuff, and then the ones that are against abortion or against that have a million kids in this ethno state that encourages all of that. And so then you could say that, some people say that similar things are going to happen in America as the Amish and other very religious groups have all the children and secularists basically fail to do that. You could say the same thing in Russia. There are many families in the active families in the Orthodox Church tend to have 4, 5, 6, up to 10, 12 children in Russia, as opposed to, when people think of the low birth rates in Moscow, you can think of any number of, cosmopolitan Muscovites or residents of St. Petersburg or Rostov-on-Don somewhere. But when you go into the churches themselves, I'm sure I don't even have to be sure. I've read some things in the past that the average number of children is much higher, of course, and that's going to be found anywhere, which again, that's a bit of a white pill on the demographic collapse in some of these places, is that sure, you may undergo some economic unfortunate times because of the loss of the equivalent population, but statistically the people that will be replacing the old population will be the more religious and conservative, just based on basic birth rate numbers and who has the most children. But with Israel and Likud being kind of the focus, I want to highlight this tweet from a famous researcher and high-level kind of Likud member, Eddie Cohen, who tweeted out about the fires in Greece and Italy that, believe it or not, the Romans and Greeks destroyed and burned the first and second temples, and in memory of their destruction today, Italy and Greece are burning. So I don't know what the implication is there. We know that these fires are caused by arsonists. We've seen videos of that in Greece and Italy. So I don't know if this guy's just admitting that Likud agents or Mossad lit these countries on fire, but I just think it's very interesting and in a way kind of embarrassing for the Jewish people that they still cope and seethe about these old, these old, these old owns that they took, and now we have to hear about how they're happy that beautiful countryside is being burned on the Mediterranean. But when it comes to the Greek issue, Dimitri, unless you have anything else you want to say about Israel, the big thing is how the Greeks are not they're not asking the Russians for aid, because we know that the Russians have the most relevant firefighting planes in kind of the region, and they're even in Turkey right now fighting fires. But it seems that due to the whole Ukraine thing and NATO membership and just general kind of globalist attitude, the Mitsotakis government and Greeks in general are not, a lot of, Greek politicians have no interest in asking Russia for that assistance. And I've seen a video of a group of Greek nationalists making a whole video saying that the country is burning, we need to accept that we were wrong, we need to ask Russia for help, and we need to stop supporting Ukraine and this degenerate Western nonsense, which I think that's the right attitude to have. It's not to say that there aren't fires in Greece every year, but these ones are getting particularly fierce, even blowing up because again, Greece had really remilitarized their islands in the face of Turkish encroachment. So there's a lot of new ammo depots, even posted equipment and whatnot on some of these places. And now they're getting engulfed in these fires and ammo's going off. And it seems that, again, like I can't imagine that, in the face of certain military conflicts like this and, these crazy weather conditions we're facing these days, that Greece talking about legalizing gay marriage and then not asking Russia for help and supporting Ukraine. I mean, that's not a recipe for success in these fields.
No, I think it's a great point in relation to Russia, because we do remember prior to COVID, the great fires that took place, not just in countries around the world, like in Russia, and of course the ones that took place in Australia as well were a big deal. But the Russian wildfires, which burnt out, I believe it was it was in the millions of hectares, and yeah, just checking up here exactly how many, almost 3 million hectares of forests were burnt out in 2019 prior to COVID, in the middle of 2019 in Siberia. So those huge wildfires, of course, set the Russian standard for firefighting to such a high, I mean, not just firefighting, but also rescue and emergency MCHS forces, which Shoigu used to run, by the way. So there's that Shoigu reference again, the Tuvan savior of mankind in Russia. But this particular theme of Russia essentially responding to emergencies has been part and parcel, like what we've seen around 2023, not just assisting African countries, but also providing assistance to Turkey, to Syria during the earthquakes, and of course the assistance being open to Greece. Of course, Russia wouldn't of course assist Greece, because Greece, even though Greece is NATO and EU and has provided aid to Ukraine, it really hasn't given that much. Greece does not have that much to give. So I think Russians in general, the Russian people, would forgive Greece. Whether or not the Kremlin would, I guess that would be open to dispute. But look, the Kremlin just forgave $23 billion worth of debt to African countries, so I'm sure they would have provided Greece some of these perks, considering the amount of pilgrimages and the transactions. I mean, just in terms of human movement that occurs between Russia and Greece, of Russians going to Greece on holidays during the summer, as well as on pilgrimages, and of course Greeks visiting Russia, or they used to visit a lot more prior to 2018 and 2022. So that also needs to be taken into consideration. But yeah, the former Minister of Defense of Greece openly pretty much stated that Greece does need Russian helicopters and firefighting technology to put out these fires. Like the former Minister of Defense kind of, put down took off his hat of staunch Greek nationalism and said that, look, yeah, we just have to admit that perhaps we were wrong in some of our foreign political aspirations to be this very strong, integral part of NATO. Sometimes we have to reach out to Russia for support, and I think that's completely right. Russia should, but then again, the Russian nationalist argument comes up. Well, should Russia actually help Greece? based on its recent rhetoric and anti-Russian statements, and also the pressure against the Russian Orthodox Church as well. And again, I think you do have to a little bit of Christian sympathy goes a long way. There is that turn the other cheek aspect, and I think it does come out. It does need to come out in moments such as this, right? A bit of mercy, a bit of clemency, and just clear thinking in regards to foreign policy. Again, hopefully the fires will be put out shortly. I'm not sure exactly what the potential escalation may be in Greece. Like, will the EU really get heavily involved, or what exactly the effects will be? But again, as we know, natural disasters. We spoke about the Dagestan earthquakes. Natural disasters are consequences of collective human sin. Saint John of Kronstadt made that very clear in the early 1900s when he said earthquakes, tsunamis, forest fires, things of this nature, tornadoes. They occur because human sin essentially taints the earth even more, to the point of the earth actually violently reacting. Also, God providentially sending these calamities to humans in order to have us recognize that, look, we don't live forever. We have to keep our mortality in mind, and also turn to Him for help, as well as it's similar to what happened in Sodom and Gomorrah in the Old Testament. We spoke about this in the earlier World War Now episode. So there is that also to keep in mind, that, well, huge wildfires and disasters happening in Greece. At the same time, there's this gigantic support for the schism and for the Ukrainian issue. I'm not saying the two things are related, but for an Orthodox mindset, they're inherently somewhat connected, okay? It's just the default position I think we have to stand on. And I'm not saying all Greeks are schismatics or anything of the sort. And it's simply, I think it's more a message to the leadership as well as the liberal pathway the country is on at the moment.
And I agree that I think if Greece asked, Russia wouldn't hesitate to help them. I think even in the Kremlin, there's an understanding that by no means does the average Greek person necessarily have any kind of weird animus towards Russia, even if they're sympathetic to Ukraine. They have a lot more complex of a relationship than that. Government aside, the Greek government those are just puppets. They almost can't be related to the Greek people themselves. But I think it's important to realize that in general, you talk about the fires. America has experienced some massive fires. People probably remember all the shots from New York, from San Francisco back in the day, where the sky is orange. The same things happened in New York City with the fires from up in Canada. I lived in Idaho for a while. There were some massive fires, turned the sky orange and whatnot, just, a few, like 100 miles away from me and whatnot. So it's all around the world, things are heating up. And now, apparently, according to modern science, the theory about there's evidence that global warming is actually coming from the Earth itself, from even like the hot supposed, things under the crust of the Earth. And I think that, if we think about biblical cosmology and what that could really mean, I think some repentance may be needed to cool the fires of hell, as one might say, because that might be what's leading to this. We've seen even an increase in volcanic activity, especially since 1980, in Mount St. Helens, and people always are talking about the possibility of Mount Hood, Yellowstone, Mount Rainier erupting, all these volcanoes. So volcano watch going on here at World War Now as well. But I think regarding, some of these other countries and some of their relations with Russia, and their, obviously China is a much cozier relationship with Russia than Greece, but all these accusations are coming out of the Western media now that China is sending a lot of equipment to Russia, more equipment than you would think. They really are helping them. And this ties into Shoigu being in North Korea, where, Dimitri, I think you would agree, he's probably securing some pretty large ammunition deals.
Yeah, pretty gigantic ammunition deals. I think North Koreans essentially their warehouses, due to the lack of war, and essentially all 70 years since they are celebrating the anniversary of the armistice at the end of the Korean War. So, and North Korea has been armed to the teeth for very long, so they do have these shells. And in terms of shells, like, we do have to remember the amount of actual ammunition the Russian artillery goes through on a daily basis is so enormous. When Prigozhin and Wagner were sieging Bakhmut, Prigozhin stated at one point that he required 80,000 shells a day in order to continue the bombardment of Bakhmut and to take it from the Ukrainians. I'm sorry, 80,000 in a day? I mean, these are enormous numbers. That's how many in a month? Millions, right? So again, it's the numbers are absolutely staggering for the layperson, not a military expert by any means, but yes, absolutely, and not just arms and ammunition for the artillery that he can secure, because I think that's exactly what's happening at the moment. The combat is very heavily based on on the artillery aspect, but also potentially, and I mean this is somewhat in the air, but North Korea does have a very functional army, and to secure even 10,000 North Korean, not mercenaries, but actually official servicemen, because that's what we're seeing. It is turning into an army of troops. Mobilizations are kind of occurring on the side, and Rush mobilization was announced at the same time, perhaps. And China, all these countries are accusing. You mentioned China, right? All these countries are accusing China of sending gear to Russia, including Kevlar, mostly defensive gear. People in 2022 were accusing Kazakhstan of sending Russia and Uzbekistan sending Russia military underwear for soldiers, right? So all these countries are accusing each other of assisting Russia in some small capacity. Nevertheless, what can Korea assist Russia with? Well, one, artillery munitions, and two, actual personnel. North Korean soldiers are very well trained. I would say even better than the Ukrainians, and probably better than a lot of European countries. That's probably one thing North Korea actually has, is a really functional army. So could Shoigu secure? He could make up for all his faults in recent years, and even the beginning of the SMO, if he secures a large contingent of North Korean troops in order to participate in Ukraine. I know it's a bit fanciful, but I think who knows at this point. I'm open to any interpretations after Wagner's move to Belarus and them talking about securing the Western Ukrainian territory from the Polish. I think I'm open to any sort of interpretation at this point.
A true yellow dawn. But it's true that, I mean, North Korea, obviously, I mean, what would be the change in their day-to-day life for sending some troops to Russia? They've been sanctioned to hell for decades, so like it's probably an easier consideration for them than other countries. That's not to say that it would be something they'd make lightly. But I mean, I think Shoigu even said that he considers the North Korean military the most powerful military in the world. So they clearly have an interest in maintaining cozy relations with North Korea and keeping that regime propped up. And North Korea's been launching all sorts of missiles and making all sorts of bellicose statements recently. But at the same token, we've seen North Korea and China getting cozier with Russia. The U.S., I think, has taken that in stride and has signed new arms deals with Taiwan as a and they've even barred pro-China Hong Kong leaders from attending some of these summits that they've been going to attend. So the U.S. is clearly pressing China. We're going to see how they respond, but again, I still have a hard time taking China seriously while the Kinmen Islands remain under Taiwanese control when they're a stone's throw from the coast of mainland China. So we're going to keep all of that in everybody's sights. Obviously, we know China has an interest in seeing the Ukrainian conflict come to a close in a specific type of way. So I'm sure that if Russia is about to move with some kind of large mobilization or something with Lukashenko in Belarus, that the Chinese are also in the know on all of that. And we talked about that Russia is striking more and more into Odessa, being able to take more territory. I mean, it's not just Odessa. They struck Rainy, the port there, which is literally 200 meters from the border of Romania. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Dimitri, before we maybe talk a little bit about Strelkov.
Well, I think it was the riskiest move, and it's precision strikes. Notice, and when we speak about the Transfiguration Cathedral, whether or not it was a Russian shell which hit it, the long-range missiles, we talk about the Russian precision in order to strike the Ukrainian targets and the ports and the depots right alongside the Romanian NATO border. I mean, this is incredibly risky and very well calculated. Can Russian missile strikes miss? Yeah, absolutely. But in this case, I think the confidence is at a sky-high level at this point, and they probably have marked out their targets long before. I would say even probably in late 2022. So they know exactly which targets to strike around the Odessa region. It's already been mapped out and well calculated. And it's the closest we've had to Russia actually touching a NATO country since, do you recall, the Ukrainian anti-air missile, of course, hitting and killing 2 Polish farmers, which they tried to accuse Russia of doing with their I mean, that was the big drama in like late 2022, which almost caused people to consider a World War III because they thought Article 5 would come into effect. But yeah, this was the closest we've seen to Russia actually firmly striking less than a kilometer away from NATO country. And of course, Romanian Orthodox country as well, incredibly stressed, but also a very firm member of NATO and very somewhat anti-Russian due to the USSR, sort of the anti-USSR stance they've had, and the history there, of course, involved. So Romania is very heavily on the Ukrainian side. namely. And the Romanian ports, of course, are used for transportation of grain as well as to house whatever's left of the Ukrainian navy. Which pretty much is nothing. But at this point, Romania was used by the Nazi Germany as well, their ports along the Black Sea coast, in order to attack what was the insignificant Black Sea fleet of the Soviet Union during World War II. So Romania was always a big actor on the Black Sea coast, and it continues to do that. So the bombardment of Odessa, gigantic, of course, news. It's the ports. The ports essentially would need to be essentially carpet bombed in order for them to lose any sort of efficacious long-term effect, because these ports, remember, just the it's similar to Azovstal and Mariupol. So these ports, there's a lot of steel, concrete. These structures were built to withstand essentially nuclear level destruction. These are old Soviet designs. They weren't built by modern Ukrainian hands. They were built by the hands of the United Soviet Union, and they were funded by the great superpower of today. These ports of Odessa won't simply get taken out by a few missile strikes from the Russian side, no matter how many times they're hit. So there is that consideration of these missile strikes. Are they actually achieving anything? And again, in terms of public relations and the effects on the church, the Transfiguration Cathedral getting hit by something or getting blown up from the inside, I'm not sure. I mean, the jury's kind of still out on this question. Like, was it blown up from the inside of an explosive plantation? Was it an anti-air missile that hit it, a Ukrainian anti-air missile, which one of their defense systems essentially striking down the Russian missiles flying in from Russia, from the Russian side, from the Russian Black Sea Fleet, striking, of course, the Ukrainian territory of Odessa, the city. And of course, the Ukrainian missile could accidentally veer off course and hit the cathedral. That's essentially what the Russian side is saying. Meanwhile, the Metropolitan of Odessa, this is the canonical member of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, 84-year-old Metropolitan Agathangel of Odessa, very prominent member of the Russian Orthodox Church in general, openly stated that the special military operation is a genocide against the Ukrainian people, and that the Russians actually hit the cathedral in Odessa. So he openly gave his opinion 2 days after the event and accused Russians of not just genocide, but also striking at Orthodox targets, which is probably one of the first. We've seen a lot of statements from hierarchs and clergymen before in regards to their anti-Russian positions in Ukraine, but this is the first time that Russia is actually accused of openly by a very senior hierarch of doing something egregious, and the effects will be deeply felt. We just had our 8-hour episode on Ukraine, the Ukrainianization, and the Union of Brest, essentially going deep into this idea of schism in the history of Ukraine. And I'm not saying that Metropolitan Agathangel of Odessa potentially is trying to push towards a schism, but these sentiments that we have to move away from Russia based on some mistakes that Russia is doing, or even potential strikes or political moves, is heavily ingrained in this idea that Ukraine needs to be independent and separated. And, we can see that in the statements of Metropolitan Onufriy, which we can go into a bit later. Very anti-Russian, very pro-Zelensky, pro-Ukrainian government open statement. So the bombardment of Odessa, again, what are the goals, right? It's hard to actually determine what Russia's trying to achieve, because notice it's almost as if the pretext of the Kerch Bridge explosion was used in order to facilitate these strikes on Odessa, and to claim that this is just part of the anti-terrorist initiative that Russia has taken after the Kerch Bridge was bombed again by an underwater drone, which we discussed last week. But it makes no sense really, because where's Odessa and where's Kerch and where's Crimea? It's kind of very far separated. So what exactly is this? Is this more of a strike against the grain deal in a way? Is it the grain deal was cancelled at the same time, so Russia needs to in fact impact Ukrainian exports of grain from Odessa? Like, it's not very clear exactly what the aim of these bombardments is. Is it is it simply just military strategy? But then the question arises, why hasn't this been done for 1.5 years prior to this? If Odessa holds such significance in the Russian military eyes, was it simply because of the grain deal? Was the grain deal the only thing holding the Russian military and the Russian Navy and Russia back from striking at Odessa? Again, very confusing, and we as laypersons don't necessarily know what's happening in the upper echelons of power and essentially how they're making these calculations. But we are affected, especially Orthodox people on the ground. Those who were attending the cathedral are affected because, well, keep hearing this argument. Well, the Ukrainian anti-air missile hit the cathedral. Well, look, the anti-air missile, it was stationed in Odessa city in order to shoot down Russian long-range strikes. So the missiles would not have been shooting in the first place if Odessa wasn't bombarded. I'm not saying Odessa shouldn't have been targeted because again, there's a war going on, and Odessa is a very key city. But that particular argument of an anti-air missile hitting the cathedral, therefore Ukrainians did it intentionally, is a little bit far-fetched. I don't think that was the case. Maybe it was. Maybe it is a big psyop. Again, Ukrainians are not beneath that. We've seen that with the dam, with Nord Stream, etc. Well, Ukrainians are very much very, very exceptional at causing these terrorist attacks, but this needs to be considered that this is a war, and the calamity caused will, of course, affect the Orthodox people. We're seeing that kind of live. The Svyatogorsk Lavra last year was bombarded by both the Russian and the Ukrainian sides. Monks died on both sides, but of course the monks solemnly held their neutrality and their more pro-Russian views at the monastery, regardless of any sort of atrocities that happened on the ground, or even monks passing away. And I think one of the Archimandrites was actually killed last year. So thankfully, not that many casualties at the moment, but Odessa is definitely a light.
Yeah, and the ports all along the Black Sea coast of Ukraine completely unusable as far as the trying to even do anything is concerned. Russia's complete dominance over the northern Black Sea, and that's really unfortunate to Britain, to Turkey, to basically everybody. And this is breaking news as well. Apparently, the port of Alexandropoli in Greece, in northeastern Greece, will be available to the French army, which is a move very much against Turkey. I only bring that up because we talked about Strelkov, who we're about to talk about a little bit more, and his perspective that this is also moving again towards a Russo-Turkish conflict, and the Black Sea is really going to be where that battlefield gets laid out. And as Russia striking all the way from the Azov Sea to in the past now to Rainy in the full extent of the Slavic, Romanian, Russian, Ukrainian, Russian claim on the Black Sea coast that they are. And I think the interesting thing one needs to consider is that, and this is almost a more scary reality, not in a bad way per se, but that at the end of the day, Russia never planned to push to Odessa at the beginning of the special military operation, for better or for worse. I don't think that's a black pill to say at this point. It just kind of is. But what it says now, that I think they're obviously considering that as well as pushing into Kharkov and other places, is that those of us who saw this going a certain way from the beginning, like us, that we had tapped into the course of civilizational history that I could say is kind of above political history. These are decisions being made above just the political decisions made in capitals like DC and Moscow. And the fact that we've been tapped into that proves that it is all real. And if this has really been like this inevitable push has been to where Russia's going to have to take all of this territory, I think it really is only a matter of time before we see Turkey enter the fray on the other side. So be sure to keep that in your prayers. Dmitry, if you have anything else to say about the Black Sea coast in general, I want to hear what. It's not too big of an update, but we do have a bit of an update on Igor Girkin, Strelkov, and his status.
I think we can probably just go into Strelkov's update. Essentially, he does mention he has a health condition. He has to take certain tablets for his heart, and I guess you did mention the fact that he does have the next hearing coming up in August, I believe.
Yeah, he has I guess it's his kind of preliminary hearing to sort of, I guess in theory, he could maybe be given house arrest or something like that. I believe this is August 29th. Perhaps maybe something will happen before August 29th, and then they'll just, I do believe that when September comes around, whatever happens, I mean, worst case scenario, I don't know, maybe they lock him up for like a year, but even then, like, I can't see anything worse than that really happening. I do think there's something to the timing of this, and we're going to be keeping up with that, because I mean, maybe something big happens, they take a bunch of territory or something, they're like, all right, we'll just let him go. Maybe he'll change his tune, maybe he'll be nicer to us on Telegram. I don't know if that's how anybody's thinking about it, but it is just curious that they chose this random thing, and now they're holding him for this 2-month period, and then they're going to be putting him on this. So we're watching it closely. We hope that he is all right. We're praying for him, but again, I hope that I don't think he's in any danger of facing some kind of assassination, thankfully, but
I think it's also noteworthy to consider the fact that, just me and Conrad were talking earlier just off stream about, well, how many people in Russia actually do support Strelkov on the ground just outside of social media, because on social media naturally he has a huge following. Well, you have to consider since 2014 Strelkov has had not a single appearance on mainstream television. So he is very much like the Alex Jones of Russia. He had zero appearances on NTV, on Channel One, on Russia 24, no appearances at all. The Russian government and the mainstream media in Russia gave him zero radio appearances. I mean, actually, no, he was on several radio channels, but not the mainstream ones. He was kind of always on the sidelines. So, and this is reflected in his court hearing. So we'll see the hearing coming up in August and September, exactly how many people will attend, but his courtroom was not full. So the actual audience participating, his supporters were there, but the courtroom was not packed like we saw during the trials of Navalny or some of these other liberal oppositionary members in Russia, which is a bit concerning. It's almost as if, well, I mean, a lot of his supporters are probably right on the front lines because they'd be the most patriotic Russians, right, in terms of the male population. But nevertheless, a vast majority of Russians simply don't know who Strelkov is, especially the boomers, those over the age of say 65, even 60, almost into retirement age, which has been increased in Russia recently. But they wouldn't have any idea of who Strelkov is or why they should support him, and even about his monarchist or Orthodox positions, which we speak about openly. Him being a stand-up layman in the Orthodox Church, I think even a lot of priests and bishops would have no idea who Strelkov was, simply because, well, the Russian government hasn't given him the audience. He's not the type of guy they were promoting. And I know it sounds weird. It's like, why wouldn't they be promoting this Orthodox, Giga Chad, monarchist type guy? Well, that's just wasn't on the cards. I mean, it's easy to speak about degenerates like Navalny all the time, and people like Prigozhin and the Wagner Battalion and the criminals and all these weird, shady characters. Why would you speak about a boring monarchist who loves Nicholas II? Something like that. I mean, that's a bit irrelevant. All about Svetogorsk Monastery and him venerating relics, things of that nature. So we hope Strelkov's hearings in the future will have more of a public attendance, and anybody around Moscow, I think we would say definitely go to these trials. Support Igor Strelkov, of course, in person. It's just it is your public duty, and these public hearings they are open to the public. So you simply just find out which courtroom he's in, and simply attend. Turn off your mobile phones, take off your hats, and just sit there. And even if you have to say the Jesus prayer, pray for him, because he does need your support at this time. He's one of the most prominent Orthodox laymen in the world in terms of actually having an impact, right? Besides not being an official political figure, in terms of not having any political power and office. So I think it's very noteworthy. We'll just keep following his case and trial as it goes along, and we'll kind of see where it all ends.
I want to shout out the guys over at the War Report, Constantine and GSP. They had some high praise for our analysis, and they had some great analysis of the Strelkov situation as well. So check out their most recent episode. It's really good. But yeah, I mean, again, we gave you his analysis on the Turkey-Russia thing, and we very much agree on that. And I just don't want him to be in jail. I think even though he was, kind of too black-pilled at certain points, I think his analysis is a lot more valuable than, some of the people that all just regurgitate the same takes over and over again. We like to bring a new thing to the table. He was doing that. That's the kind of analysis we like to keep up with. And you said that, why isn't Russia supporting all of this? Well, look, Russia compared to the West, you could say is based, but like that doesn't mean that they're not, very much, and their elites are very much pushing against like the true based, actions that need to be taken. Yeah, it'd be great if you could, if everyone was a monarchist and Tsargrad TV was just as prominent as Channel One and all these other things. But at the end of the day, like you said, Strelkov is in jail, and it's really much easier for Putin to gain those kinds of points doing something like banning, transsexualism like the Chinese have, which sure, that's great, but like let's be honest, like how many transsexuals really are there in Russia? Like let's be honest, like this is just something that's like you it's just an easy win, something that doesn't need to be as in it's not as much of a real change as people may want to think. And I think that's kind of the situation in Russia. It's all kind of fractal and relative based on your starting point. And that being said, we've seen like part of the whole Africa thing is the fact that countries like Uganda and these other countries are very against the global homo LGBT stuff, and that combined with this debt forgiveness and their more cordial relations with China is really pushing them in the Russian sphere. So this is definitely a trend we're going to see more of in regards to that kind of stuff. And hopefully people like Strelkov are able to thrive in those more conservative multipolar worlds and not be oppressed just because they happen to be slightly more to the right of the allowed based discourse. But I think unless you have anything else to say about all of that situation, I think we got to talk about the crazy UFO stuff going on in Congress, where all these spooks, I'm very skeptical of what they have to say, are testifying under oath that they have, secondhand evidence of non-human bodies recovered from non-human ships and all these sorts of things. Everyone's talking about Operation Bluebeam. And I'm not one of these people that says every news story is a distraction. People might say this is a distraction from Ukraine's about to lose. This is a distraction from looking at the 10,000th picture of Hunter Biden's penis. But I think in general, this is something that if you've been following any kind of Orthodox circles online or following us, we had a big show on this, if like, I don't know, maybe 10, 15 episodes back, I don't remember. But this is something that we keep up with. We're big fans of Father Seraphim Rose, Father Spiridon Bailey, what they've said about this stuff. And it's very obvious that the ideas from some intelligent source, maybe it's from, maybe it really is being played out where the media doesn't take it too seriously because it would be suspicious, but for better or for worse, some intelligence entity is very interested in seeding the idea of extraterrestrial life and first contact and stuff like this in the eyes of not just the American people at this point, but the entire world. Based on, I mean, English is just understandable all around the world, so this stuff is gonna reverberate all across the world, not just the U.S.
Yeah, I think before I go into my analysis of like Area 51, I want to give my analysis of the Kiev Pechersky Lavra, two very important areas in the world, in terms of A4 hour and activity. The Kiev Pechersky Lavra, of course, held a meeting recently between major hierarchs, and Metropolitan Onufry was present, and he gave a very pro-Ukrainian speech. Like, this happened literally less than 24 hours ago. I don't think any Orthodox journalist sites actually commented on it simply because it was so striking. He said, "We support the full sovereignty of Ukraine. In its entirety. So the entirety of Ukraine needs to be reunited, including Crimea." Metropolitan Onufry kind of put his foot down on that and said that we support the Ukrainian army and the Ukrainian state and everything. And it's just like, okay, well, what about Metropolitan Paul, and what about the persecutions? What about? And he also said, I kid you not, paraphrasing Metropolitan Onufry, and again, this is probably his position in order to gain, at least to ease the persecution somewhat, trying to gain favor from the Zelensky regime. But we do see him saying that the occupied territories, which the Russians control, also Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk, Crimea, and Kherson, they're having disruptions in terms of apparently diocesan control and administration. So he's saying that the church isn't functioning properly in those particular disparate zones, despite the fact that in Western Ukraine, some cities don't even have Orthodox churches open. So the persecution is you have churches raided, being taken away. So it's almost like, I'm not sure where he's trying to go with this, and that combined with Metropolitan Agathangel statement recently, it has been, it's just simply like a pretty strong statement, like about just the situation there. So yeah, that's right. This particular opinion of Metropolitan Onufry was, of course, criticized by Strelkov in the past. So he's one of the prominent people who has called out this essentially very pro-Ukrainian position of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which could be justified in some extent. But the reason I'm going to bring up the story is because it will be developing in the next few weeks. This staunch support by the UOC MP of the Ukrainian government. We'll see exactly how or where this goes, especially as the Russian military operation, the special military operation, ramps up, and if we see a potential counteroffensive in autumn, how the church reacts to that, the Ukrainian church as well as the Russian church, which seems to be staunchly supporting Putin and his SMO project. We'll see exactly where this goes. Church relations seem to be very much hinged on what happens on the ground in terms of military, unfortunately, but nevertheless, the schism in Ukraine, of course, continues, and we pray for Metropolitan Onufry and his church in making the wisest decisions possible in this tough time. But again, the alien stories appearing in the U.S., it does, at least on one hand, seem like a huge distraction from, essentially not just what's happening with Ukraine, but also completely to erase any sort of memory of COVID, and we'll be focusing on an external enemy, an external threat, as well as the potential psyop. You have hippies and hipsters of all sorts, those who essentially want to somehow commune with these aliens and kind of communicate with them, and they go alien looking. It's almost like a new religion of sorts, right? We have this massive religious uprising, and again, it's mostly based on this Joe Rogan-like culture that there's something out there, which, the fact is there is something out there. It's called actual Christianity, which has been out there this entire time, and people just simply haven't been seeking it. But nevertheless, and the US Congress, and it seems like the US elites, are supporting this notion of releasing segments of information, whether or not it's real, but these stories about the extraterrestrial encounters and it is very confusing, I think, for a non-American audience, especially those in Asia, those in Europe. Essentially, what the American people are seeing and viewing right now is, yeah, it's kind of just up in the air. Essentially, what will be the impacts of all these stories coming out, and Tucker Carlson and all these major figures covering them?
Yeah, a lot of people are, the fact that the media isn't covering it like a normal story is kind of, it gives more credence to it in a way that it's not just obviously a psyop to some people, but it's, again, some of these people have dubious, origin stories, these people testifying. There's a lot of evidence that a lot of this still stems from Harry Reid, the former senator from Nevada who had a weird obsession with UFOs and aliens and everything. And again, it is true that the UFO sighting phenomenon is largely an American thing. It's like 100 times more likely to see any kind of UFO in America. All the sightings come from America. You can see kind of on like a heat map of, density of sightings. It's really quite an American thing. And that's, you could say that has to do with the fact that the US is testing experimental stuff, that there's maybe just more demons in the United States, if you're coming from that perspective. But, there's, there's a few different ways to skin that cat. But these days they're calling them UAPs, which I think is, unidentified aerial phenomenon or some kind of other, I think there's a few different actually ways to do UAP, but it's they're not saying UFO as much anymore. I'm sure that's intentional to not just immediately be associated with sci-fi films. But I think all of this is still fundamentally rooted in everyone's understanding of sci-fi movies and all sorts of incorrect understandings of cosmology and how the world works. But yeah, I mean, it's been a big week. I think unless you have anything else to say, we can kind of wrap everything up again. Things coming around with Belarus and with Russia. I think that's still like the biggest news, and we're going to be watching that very closely. I think actually one other thing before we end, I saw India on a poll had, based on its like perception of China, it hates China the most these days. Like their disdain for China had grown the most statistically since the last poll had been taken. And of course, we've talked about Arunachal Pradesh in the past and how, again, we just said North Korea, Russia, China, they're all kind of uniting in the face of this Taiwan thing. And it seems that and we're seeing all this other influence with these Christian persecution in India and this anti-Modi stuff that he's, a Hindu nationalist and an extremist. So it seems that, maybe the U.S. is going to activate India as its trump card against China. But Dimitri, I want to hear your last comments on the state of World War III right now all over.
I think the state of World War Three again. Well, the World War Three will, as a Cold War, is still ongoing, and it's only heating up, so to speak. It's only getting warmer around here. But yeah, the US's move to ally itself with India, we've spoken about on previous episodes. It is very much in order to pit India against the US's, I guess, economic rival China, and also perhaps to cause a rift amongst the BRICS unofficial alliance, this almost economic membership alliance of sorts, because BRICS seems to be one of the only things uniting India and China. Notice, and what do we have occurring? I guess in late August, the biggest event coming up, which we'll be of course covering very intensely, is the BRICS summit. And so the US, the only thing that can really affect the BRICS summit in a way, it's not even the Middle Eastern countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, which seem to be getting along quite fine now, surprisingly. It's that India, Chinese, these two key members of BRICS, the Indian and Chinese rivalry, which the US is going to agitate immensely now, right? So that's what people need to look out for, and that's most likely in the news. It'll be a big subject. Well, but I think the politicians in both these nations, they actually understand that. So it's already being gamed out in a way. Like they know what they have to gain and what they have to lose, and they simply won't fall for basic psyops that the U.S. can probably force in somewhere in South America, pitting countries and militias against one another and running all these various war games and interventions. But yeah, so I don't think India and China are susceptible to that. But again, these two countries have their own civilizations. Essentially, they're both multiple thousands and hundreds of years old. So these two ancient countries essentially are independent, and they do have their own national gripes against one another. So regardless of how powerful the BRICS alliance is and how sturdy they keep the relations between the two, there's still a chance of them essentially going at it in the future. I mean, it's not exactly off the table. So I do think in terms of international relations, the BRICS Chinese relationship does need to be viewed, and it's probably potentially the only thing that could throw the entire BRICS multipolarity project off the rails at this point.
Yeah, we're going to be watching it very closely, and we're going to be watching all the hot spots, like you said, like the Sahel region of Africa, the Caucasus with Azerbaijan and Armenia. We're going to watch Turkey and Greece, obviously Belarus's involvement in Russia and Ukraine. And this is again, it's painting that picture. Things are heating up all over. I mean, there's almost no, again, North America is still remaining a bit untouched for now. I mean, we'll see how some things heat up in Central America as Bukele attempts to maybe unite all of these Central American countries. But yeah, I mean that's about the show right there. I mean we've kind of covered basically everything. Of course, in America, the Antiochian Archdiocesan Convention is going on. Patriarch John is here with newly, you know, elevated Metropolitan Saba, the head of the Antiochians in America. So a lot of good things happening there. And like you said, big thing, we got to keep the church in Ukraine in our prayers, despite some, controversial statements coming out of both sides and tensions running hot. So we'll be sure to keep, if you want to see our take on the potential upcoming visit of Pope Francis to Moscow, we talk about that on episode 13 of Ether Hour, which we'll have that linked below. Everyone should tune into and subscribe for that. We talk about the Union of Brest and the Uniates in general, Josephat Kuntsevich, and kind of the history of all that and how it's reflected today. So yeah, be sure to check out the description. Dimitri, I'll leave you on some last words before we do the plugs.
Yeah, I think everybody, we are in this interesting period where the world does seem like it's getting really intense. We're hearing these bizarre stories about Russia potentially fighting Poland, about the pressures in the Middle East. Africa looks like it's alight. Europe has riots, but do of course keep your own spirituality alight. Attend church every Sunday. Look into Orthodox Christianity if you aren't an Orthodox Christian thinker, and an attendant of church. Like if you haven't ever thought about Orthodox Christianity, it's a good time to actually look into it. Invest in yourself first and foremost. Invest in your own families. Look into Orthodox Christianity. Speak to your local Orthodox priest. It does go a long way, especially given all these bizarre and somewhat controversial news occurring around us right now. We don't know where exactly the world will be in a few years, or even your own local nation may be thrown into some sort of anarchy. Like as we've seen, you don't know when the next major event or the next major psyop will affect you, just as COVID has. So while we have this freedom, I guess, in a lot of first world Western countries, we should exploit that and actually use this freedom to invest in our knowledge of Christianity, attend Orthodox Christian churches, and just promote the sort of good, righteous virtue. I think that's probably the main takeaway, especially given all the negative news we've seen around the world, and just this, essentially a push towards World War III, like a big hot war around the world, which we've been seeing throughout the last 3 years, almost since the beginning of COVID. It's just something we need to keep in mind, is that personal care needs to be taken, spiritually speaking.
Yeah, that's a good way to leave it. So with all that, worldwarnow.substack.com. Be sure to check us out there for all our articles, all the episodes of Ether Hour, every episode of World War Now. Subscribe on YouTube, like the video, that really helps us out. Leave a comment. Follow us on Twitter, World War Now _. Follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. Telegram's a great place to keep up with us for 24/7 news. We're always posting on there. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Like I said, this week's Ether Hour, Union of Brest. Be sure to check that out. Episode 12, still getting rave reviews about the land of Chud and Putin gnome theory, so don't miss that one. We really do appreciate those who have subscribed. It really helps us out a lot. And with all of that, we'll see you next time. God bless.